If you build a taxable brokerage account the same way you build a retirement account, you can make a very expensive mistake without realizing it for years. That is the truth. A great many people think investing is just investing. Buy good funds. Hold them. Let time do the heavy lifting. That is true as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough. Because where you hold an investment changes how that investment behaves for you. A retirement account and a taxable brokerage may both hold ETFs, but they do not play by the same rules. One of them gives you shelter, the other gives you freedom. And if you do not understand the trade between those two, you can quietly hand a meaningful slice of your returns to taxes, bad product design, and lazy portfolio construction. That is the kind of mistake people make when they know just enough to get started and not enough to be dangerous in the right direction. So if I were explaining this in the plainest possible way, I would begin here. A taxable brokerage is not a 401k. It is not a traditional IRA. It is not a Roth IRA. It is not protected by the same tax treatment. It is not governed by the same withdrawal rules. And because it is not the best ETF for a retirement account, is not automatically the best ETF for a taxable brokerage. That is the first lesson. The source makes this distinction immediately. It says investing in a taxable brokerage is very different from investing in a 401k IRA or Roth IRA because of taxes. Retirement accounts are either tax-deferred or tax-free in the case of a Roth, while a taxable brokerage gives you penalty, free access, but taxes capital gains and dividends along the way. File site turn 40 file 0 Fay. That is where an adult portfolio discussion begins. Not with hype, not with what is trending, not with the ETF some man on the internet called a forever hold without ever mentioning taxes, with structure. What kind of account is this? What is this account for? What kind of friction will taxes create? How much flexibility do I want? What kind of cash flow do I need? What kind of growth do I want? What part of this portfolio needs safety? What part needs muscle? And what part is allowed to be more aggressive? Those are the questions. Now, the great advantage of a taxable brokerage is simple. You can access the money whenever you want. That flexibility matters. If you want to retire early, if you want another bucket outside your retirement plan, if you want optionality, if you want capital available before age 59 and a half, that is real value. But every advantage has a price. And in the taxable brokerage, the price is taxes. If you buy something at $100 and later sell it for $150, you will owe taxes on the $50 of gain. If your ETF pays dividends, you may owe taxes on those dividends, even if you never touch the cash and simply reinvest it. That is the part many people miss. They think reinvesting means avoiding tax. Reinvesting is still receiving, and receiving inside a taxable account may still create a tax bill. The source says this directly too. In a taxable brokerage, if you sell an asset for a gain, that gain is taxable. And if the asset pays dividends, you may owe taxes on those distributions even if you reinvest them right back into the fund. At the end of the year, part of what shows up on the tax document can come from those dividends. File site. turn 40 file 0 Fay. That single fact should already tell you something important. Dividend bearing assets in a taxable brokerage must be chosen carefully, not emotionally, not because the yield looks seductive on a screen. Carefully. A high-yield ETF can be wonderful in the wrong account and mediocre in the right account, or wonderful in the right account and bad in the wrong one. Account location matters, tax character matters. And that brings me to one of the biggest traps in this whole conversation, the beautiful trap of high income. People love high-yield products because they make the portfolio feel productive, cash every month. A juicy yield, a number that looks like it can solve the need for income. The temptation is obvious, but temptation and suitability are not the same thing. The source gives a very useful example here with JEPQ. It points out that JEPQ's dividend looks excellent on the surface, almost 10%, but much of that distribution is ordinary income rather than qualified dividends, making it generally tax inefficient in a taxable brokerage, especially for people still earning strong income. The source says those kinds of covered call ETFs are often better suited to tax-advantaged accounts. Fay Filocyte Fay Turn 40 File 0 Fay. That is exactly the kind of mistake I want people to stop making. They see 10% and stop thinking. They see monthly income and stop asking what kind of income it is. They forget that a taxable brokerage is not just about what the ETF pays. It is about what the IRS thinks about what the ETF pays. Qualified dividends and non-qualified dividends are not the same creature. One may be taxed at much more favorable rates. The other may be taxed as ordinary income. That is a huge difference, especially if you are in your highest earning years, especially if you live in a state with additional tax burdens, especially if this account is meant to build wealth efficiently over a long period. The source spells this out clearly. If the ETF produces qualified dividends, those dividends may be taxed at lower rates, sometimes even 0% depending on income, but often around 15%. If the dividends are not qualified, they may be taxed at your ordinary income rate, which can be dramatically higher. Fay Filocyte Fay Turn 40 File 0 Fay. That is why I would never start a taxable brokerage portfolio conversation with what yields the most. That is a beginner. S question. The adult question is, what gives me the best after-tax combination of growth, diversification, safety, and usable income for the role this account is supposed to play? That is the frame. Now, the source organizes the best ETFs into categories, and I think that is the right way to think, not as random tickers, as jobs. Each ETF should have a job. A portfolio is not a pile of symbols. It is a system of jobs. And once you think that way, the confusion falls away very quickly. The first job is what I would call value and dividend support. This is the part of the portfolio that gives you some cash flow, some downside resilience, and exposure to steadier businesses. The source says this category has two major responsibilities: producing a useful dividend and helping provide good downside protection through lower volatility, more recession-resistant companies. It points to SCHG, VIM, and VTV as the top ETFs in this area, with SGOV favored more for higher dividend cash flow, and VTV favored more for lower dividend payouts and potentially lower taxes. Fay Filocyte Fay Turn 40 File 0 Fay. That is sensible, because not every part of a taxable brokerage should try to be high-octane growth. That is how people build portfolios that look exciting in bull markets and feel unbearable when the market reminds them what volatility actually means. I like having a segment of the portfolio that is calmer, not sleepy. Calmer a portfolio should not only run fast, it should also survive. That matters, especially as you age, especially if this account is serving as a bridge to early retirement, especially if you are still working in high-income years and want taxable efficiency, especially if you simply want a portfolio that does not feel like an emotional hostage situation every time the market has a bad week. Now, among those value and dividend options, there are trade-offs. SCHG is often beloved because it gives a stronger yield and a very respectable group of dividend-paying U.S. companies. VIM is broader and simpler in a very vanguard sort of way. VTV leans into value with less focus on maximizing dividend cash flow, which can make it particularly attractive in a taxable account where lower distributions may reduce the annual tax drag. The source specifically says that if you want higher dividend cash flow, it would choose SCHG, but if you want to minimize taxes as much as possible and potentially get better share appreciation, it would lean toward VTV. Fay Filocyte Fay Turn 40 File 0 Fay. That is exactly how I would want someone to think, not which one is best for the internet. Which one best fits my account, my tax situation, and my portfolio SGOV list. Now, let us talk about cash, because people holding a taxable brokerage account often want someplace to park money. Not everything in the account is necessarily waiting to be invested immediately. Sometimes you want dry powder, sometimes you want a temporary holding spot, sometimes you want a low-risk sleeve, and here again, taxes and account choice matter. The source says money markets can be a good place to hold cash and have recently paid attractive yields, but it also notes that those yields are subject to falling as Fed rates fall. It then explains a personal preference for SGOV because the fund offers a competitive yield and no state tax, which can be particularly attractive for higher earners living in high-tax states. It also says traditional bond ETFs generally do not belong in a taxable brokerage because their interest distributions are usually taxed as ordinary income. Fay file cite Fay turn 40 file 0 Fay. That is a very important practical point. People often treat cash and bond like positions as if all conservative holdings are interchangeable. They are not. If you are holding something mostly for stability or temporary parking, the tax treatment still matters. That is why a Treasury bill ETF like SGOV can make so much sense for some investors. In taxable accounts, you get short duration government exposure. You get liquidity, you get a yield, and depending on your state, you may avoid state tax on that income. That is not glamorous. Good tax. Aware investing is not supposed to be glamorous. It is supposed to be intelligent. And I want to emphasize something else here. A lot of people who are new to taxable brokerage accounts overestimate how much complexity they need. They think a sophisticated portfolio is a good portfolio. It is not. A good portfolio is one whose parts know their jobs and whose owner knows why each part is there. That is sophistication, not complexity for its own sake. Now we move to the second great job in the taxable account, the foundation. This is the part that is not supposed to be clever. It is supposed to be reliable. It is supposed to give you broad exposure to the U.S. market, long-term compounding, and a durable engine of growth that has survived war, inflation, recessions, panics, bubbles, and every other variety of financial drama. The source calls this foundational and says the key ETFs here are those that track either the S&P 500 or the total U.S. stock market. It points to VOO and VTI as the leading examples, while also noting that other S&P 500 trackers like SPLG type products may be nearly identical if the expense ratio is competitive. The source's main message is that the foundation should be broad, durable, and built for long-term compounding. Fay file cite Fay turn 40 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. You do not build a long-term taxable brokerage portfolio on fashion. You build it on broad ownership. I have always liked the idea of owning America in the simplest sensible form. That is what an S&P 500 ETF does. That is what a total market ETF does in slightly wider form. You are not betting on one story. You are not betting on one CEO. You are not betting on one hot sector. You are owning a large piece of productive enterprise. That is what investing should feel like. Now, the source compares VTI and VOO and notes that they have tracked very closely over long periods, with the S&P 500 slightly ahead over the last couple of decades. It says that over about 25 years, annual returns have been quite close, with VOO a bit stronger but both funds producing excellent long-run compounding. Fay file cite Fay turn 40 file 0 Fay. That comparison is useful because people waste an astonishing amount of time obsessing over tiny differences between excellent options. That is one of the great ironies of investing. People will overanalyze the distance between two excellent broad market ETFs while doing far less work on the things that matter much more. Their savings rate, their account structure, their tax awareness, their behavior during drawdowns, their ability to stay invested, their willingness to automate. VOO versus VTI is not the kind of problem that ruins financial lives. Behavior ruins financial lives. Poor structure ruins financial lives. Tax neglect ruins financial lives. An S&P 500 fund and a total market fund are both perfectly respectable anchors. Pick one that fits your philosophy and use your time to worry about something more consequential. Now, the third job is diversification outside the United States. This is one of those areas where emotion and recent performance can mislead people badly. International investing is often either ignored entirely or suddenly treated as the hottest thing in the world whenever foreign markets have a strong year. Neither extreme is wise. The source says this category is purely for diversification and points to VXUS as the leading broad international ETF, providing exposure to over 8,500 companies across Europe. emerging markets, the Pacific region, and other areas. It also emphasizes that while international ETFs can outperform in certain windows, long-term they have generally underperformed broad U.S. funds, so enthusiasm should be kept in check. Faithful site, Fay turn 40, file 0 Fay, that is the right attitude. Use it for diversification. Do not turn it into a religion. If your core wealth engine is America, a measured international sleeve can still make sense. It gives you exposure to economic activity outside the United States. It prevents the portfolio from becoming a one-country monoculture. It may help in environments where international markets outperform for a time. But the key word is measured, not dominant, not ideological measured. A lot of investors make one of two mistakes here. They either hold none at all and become overconfident in domestic concentration, or they treat diversification as if every slice must be equally weighted, even when long-term return profiles have been very different. I prefer moderation. A modest international allocation can be useful. A heroic one is usually unnecessary for a taxable brokerage whose main engine is broad U.S. equity ownership. Now we come to the fourth job, and this is where many people start getting more excited: growth. Not narrow speculation, broad growth. This part of the portfolio is supposed to provide more firepower, more upside, more volatility, more innovation, more growth orientation, but still broad enough to be respectable as a core sleeve, rather than a lottery ticket. The source calls this broad growth and says the best example is an ETF tied to the NASDAQ 100, with QQQM highlighted as the favorite because it provides exposure to the same index as QQQ, but at a lower expense ratio. It also mentions SCHG, VOO, and SMEO as other strong options with excellent recent and long-run performance. Fay file a site, Fay turn 40, file 0 Fay, that is the right category for the right investor. You want some growth force in a taxable brokerage. You want something that can outrun a more conservative sleeve over time. You want exposure to companies that are not merely stable but powerful, innovative, and capable of driving a portfolio forward. But again, the job matters. This is a sleeve, not the whole identity of the portfolio. Because the minute people discover growth, they start wanting only growth. And that is how they build portfolios that feel marvelous, when technology is soaring, and intolerable when reality returns. QQQM is a very sensible answer here. It gives you the NASDAQ 100. It gives you major technology leadership. It gives you growth orientation. It gives you broad exposure within that growth universe. It avoids the slightly higher fee of QQ for investors who do not need the trading liquidity and branding appeal of the older fund. The source also points out that SCHG and VOO are excellent, lower-cost, broad growth alternatives, and that SMO has had especially strong recent performance with a momentum orientation. Fay Felicite Fay turn 40 file 0 Fay, this is where the investor's temperament really matters. Some people prefer the heavy technology leadership of QQM. Some prefer a large cap growth expression like SCHG or VOO with very low fees. Some like the momentum logic of SMO. Fine. Again, I do not worship the ticker. I care about the job. Does this sleeve increase the growth potential of the taxable brokerage while still remaining broad enough and disciplined enough to be held with conviction? That is the question. If the answer is yes, then you are in the right territory. Now at last we get to the fifth category, aggressive growth. This is optional, and it is optional for a reason, because now you are stepping beyond broad growth and into more concentrated sector-specific or specialty exposure. This is where people can either intelligently add a small amount of extra upside potential or foolishly turn a sound portfolio into an emotional theme park. The source describes this category as the most volatile and says it should be a smaller portion of the portfolio, used only depending on the investor's risk tolerance and goals. It gives examples like SMH for semiconductors, XME for metals and mining, IBIT for Bitcoin exposure, and VGT for technology. While specifically highlighting VGT as the favorite because it offers more upside than the earlier categories, but with broader consistency than some of the more speculative alternatives. Fay file a site, Fay turn 40, file 0 Fay, that is a very reasonable way to think. If you want an aggressive growth sleeve, I want it to be intentional. Not a reaction to excitement, not a response to FOMO, not a collection of themes you barely understand. Intentional. Now, among those aggressive options, VGT stands out because it is still sector specific. Yes, but not absurdly narrow. You are getting information technology. You are getting many hundreds of companies. You are getting semiconductors, hardware, software, communications equipment, and related technological infrastructure. You are not hanging the entire sleeve on one tiny niche. That is why it can make so much sense for the right investor. The source explicitly says VGT is the favorite in this category because it is less volatile than some of the more concentrated speculative ideas, while still offering far more upside than the earlier, more conservative parts of the portfolio. It notes its strong long-run consistency and broad technology exposure. Faithfully cite FETURN 40, File 0 FE. That is exactly the kind of aggressive sleeve I can respect. Aggressive, but not reckless focused, but not ridiculous, powerful but still investable by an adult who values sleep. SMH is another fascinating example, but now you are leaning far more heavily into semiconductors. That can be wonderful when that industry is on fire. It can be brutal when it is not. The source says this plainly too, noting that SMH has produced spectacular returns, but that its heavy concentration means the ETF could fall very sharply if the semiconductor space or supply chain gets hit. Faithful cite FETURN 40 File 0 FE. That is why I would treat something like SMH as seasoning, not the meal. And as for things like metals and mining or Bitcoin-linked exposures, I want to say something clearly. Specialty exposure is not evil. It is simply less forgiving. If you use it, size it accordingly, respect the volatility. Do not pretend it is a foundation. Do not build your identity on it. Do not let a small aggressive sleeve become a psychological obsession. Now, the source does something that I think is especially useful for viewers, and that is portfolio construction by life stage and risk profile. That is where all of this theory becomes practical. The source gives 3 example portfolios, one for a younger investor with higher risk tolerance and a strong growth orientation, one for a middle-aged investor with moderate risk who already has retirement accounts but wants the taxable brokerage to help build more wealth or support earlier retirement, and one for a person nearing or in retirement who wants more safety and cash flow. Faithful cite FETURN 40 File 0 FE. That is the right way to think. Not what is the perfect ETF portfolio for humanity. What is the right mix for this person? In this account, at this stage of life, with this level of risk tolerance and this goal that is adult investing. For the younger investor, the source leans more heavily into growth. SCHG at 25%, VOO at 30%, VXUS at 5%, QQQM at 25%, and VGT at 15%. The message is clear. Still keep a dividend and value component, still keep the foundation, still diversify internationally, but allow the growth and aggressive growth sleeves to do real work because time is on your side. Faithful cite FETURN 40 File 0 FE. That is sensible. Young investors need compounding and growth. They do not need only income. They do not need the whole portfolio acting like a retiree's account. They need force. But force without structure becomes recklessness. That is why even the young allocation in the source still keeps balance across categories. Then the middle-aged example becomes more tax-aware and a bit more moderate. The source recommends VTV at 33%, VU at 25%, VXUS at 10%, SCHG at 22%, and VGT at 10%, specifically noting that this person is often in peak earning years and may want lower taxes for now. Faithful cite FETURN 40 File 0 FE. That adjustment is exactly the kind of nuance people forget. Taxable brokerage construction is not just about return. It is about after-tax return. It is about suitability for your life stage. It is about the fact that someone in their 40s or 50s often has different needs from someone at 28. And then the near retirement or in retirement example becomes much more conservative and income aware SCHG at 50%, VOO at 20%, VXUS at 15%, and VUG at 15%, with no allocation to the highest risk-aggressive category. The source says this version prioritizes safety and dividend cash flow while still keeping some growth and diversification. Fay file a site, Fay turn 40 file 0 Fay, that is exactly right. As you approach retirement, you do not become a different species. You still need growth, you still need ownership, you still need inflation resistance. But your taxable brokerage may start serving as an income, supporting bucket, a supplemental reserve, or another source to draw from in retirement, alongside tax-advantaged accounts. So the whole personality of the portfolio may shift: more calm, more qualified income, less appetite for the most volatile themes, still enough growth that the account does not become brittle. That is a mature allocation philosophy. Now, I want to say something else the source implies, but that deserves to be said directly. A taxable brokerage should not be built in isolation from the rest of your financial life. The source notes that it is assuming these example investors also have retirement accounts growing and have an emergency fund in place. That matters enormously because the right taxable allocation depends in part on what is already happening elsewhere. Fay file a site, Fay turn 40 file 0 Fay, that point is crucial. If your 401k is very conservative, your taxable brokerage may need to carry more growth. If your retirement accounts are already growth heavy, your taxable brokerage may take on a different role. If you're already sitting on ample cash, the taxable account does not need to pretend to be your emergency fund. If you have no liquidity anywhere else, then you may need more caution here. This is why no single video, no single list, no single set of tickers can replace thinking. The list is the beginning, the structure is the point. Now let me tell you where people go wrong with these kinds of videos. They start ticker collecting, they hear 5 categories, and think they now need 5 tickers. Number, you need jobs. If fewer tickers do the jobs, use fewer tickers. If one broad market fund, one value Fay dividend fund, and one growth fund are enough for your taxable brokerage, that may be entirely sufficient. If you want a little international diversification, add it with clarity. If you want a little aggressive technology exposure and understand the trade-off. Fine, but the point is not to fill slots for the sake of feeling sophisticated. The point is to design a portfolio that makes sense. That is why I have always preferred thoughtful simplicity. Simple is not unsophisticated. Simple means each piece can be explained in one sentence. This is my tax-aware value and dividend sleeve. This is my U.S. foundation. This is my international diversifier. This is my broad growth engine. This is my optional aggressive growth spice. That is a portfolio. That is understandable. That is holdable. That is the kind of structure an ordinary investor can actually live with through time. Now let me turn this into the plainest possible lesson. If I were building a taxable brokerage in 2026 and wanted something I could buy and hold for a very long time, I would think in exactly these 5 jobs. First, a value and dividend sleeve that respects tax efficiency and gives some ballast. SCHG if I want more dividend cash flow, VTV if I want even lower tax drag and cleaner value exposure. Second, a core U.S. foundation, VO or VTI. Pick the one that fits your philosophy and then stop pretending the tiny difference between them is the key to your future. Third, a measured international diversifier, VXUS, sized modestly, used as a diversifier rather than a messianic bet. Fourth, a broad growth engine, QQQM, South Carolina HG, VUG, or even SEMO if the momentum logic suits you and you understand it. Fifth, if and only if it suits your temperament, a smaller aggressive growth sleeve. VGT is the cleanest answer here for most people who want extra upside without falling into the most speculative corners of the market. That is a serious taxable brokerage framework, and I want to say this once more because it is the whole point. The wrong ETF in the wrong account can quietly hold you back for years. The source says exactly this too. It warns that the wrong type of ETF in the wrong category or the wrong percentage mix can set a person back materially in trying to reach retirement goals on time. Fay file a site, Fay turn 40 file 0 Fay. That is why I care about the tax details. That is why I care about qualified dividends. That is why I care about not putting ordinary income bond funds or the wrong covered call products in the wrong place. That is why I care about role clarity. Not because cleverness is fun, because time is expensive. And when you put a taxable brokerage together properly, you are not just buying ETFs. You are building a machine for growth, a machine for optionality, a machine for flexibility, a machine that can supplement retirement, support early retirement, or simply give you another clean bucket of capital outside the walls of your tax-advantaged accounts. That is what I would want people to understand, not just what 5 ETFs are interesting, what jobs need to be done. Once you understand the jobs, the portfolio becomes much easier to build, and once the portfolio is built with the right jobs in mind, it becomes much easier to hold, and holding well is still, after all these years, where most of the money is made.